And welcome to the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February 12th. My name is Pam, and let's begin with our first article. Battleground States ask, is voting in America too easy or too hard? By Patrick Johnson. Savannah, Georgia. How easy should it be to vote in the United States? The answer to that question, like so many other things in 21st century America, depends on where one sits politically. Republicans believe voter fraud threatens the integrity and fairness of U.S. elections. Democrats see voter suppression as one of the greatest challenges to a democratic process that values everyone equally. Nearly 160 million people voted in 2020, the highest number ever and the greatest percentage in 120 years. But instead of viewing that as a sign of a healthy and active democracy, many Americans have doubts about the outcome and are concerned that somehow something went wrong. Now, the election, having already been weighed in by dozens of state and federal courts, including the U.S. Supreme Court, is being scrutinized by state lawmakers on both sides of the aisle as they examine ways to shape future elections and their own party's political fortunes. We live in a country that historically has had a very strained relationship with the right to vote, says Garrett Epps, an emeritus law professor at the University of Baltimore. There's a lot of leeway for anti democratic, authoritarian ideologues to claim the blessing of the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution gives state legislatures the power to determine how elections are run. However, as some 90 judges made plain in more than 60 court cases filed by lawyers for former President Donald Trump and his allies, those rules need to be established before elections are held, not after. In just the first weeks of 2021, 37 state legislatures introduced, pre-filed, or carried over more than 500 bills to expand voting access, far exceeding the 188 expansive bills filed at the start of the 2020 legislative session, according to Brennan Center for Justice. These bills would continue the trend of the past 100 years to make it easier for Americans, including women and minorities, to exercise their civic duty, including by absentee voting. But more than 165 bills in 33 states, including the 2020 battlegrounds of Pennsylvania, Arizona, and Georgia, would tighten voting rules. That's up from 35 the previous year. These include everything from adding identification requirements to mail-in voting in Georgia to one Arizona measure that would allow state lawmakers to overturn the popular vote and declare the winner themselves. Athena Solomon first heard a similar idea proposed about 5 years ago when she became an Arizona state representative in 2017. A newly elected Republican lawmaker had a suggestion that took her aback. Why not abolish the 17th Amendment and return the right to pick U.S. senators to state legislatures? It's a power grab, says State Representative Solomon, now the Democratic minority whip, and it means this decade will show whether Republicans can widen their umbrella or will further evolve into a party that fully embraces authoritarianism. Concerns in Pennsylvania and Georgia. Some GOP election officials, like Al Schmidt in Philadelphia, which live streamed its vote count in the name of transparency, stand by election workers' valiant efforts to uphold democracy during a pandemic. But others in his party saw election day chaos, and state lawmakers have filed 14 bills to restrict voting. I wouldn't say that the real concern is that states will keep voters from voting, but it's really about addressing legitimate integrity issues and different philosophies of what is a good election, says John Fortier, an election integrity expert at the Conservative Learning American Enterprise Institute in Washington. There's a big ideology pushing on both sides. Yes, integrity is good and openness is good, but sometimes with these practices, it's a little bit more complicated. Pennsylvania GOP lawmakers interviewed, while mostly not alleging widespread fraud, point to confusion and their voters' concern that something went wrong during the 2020 election. Constant but evidence free allegations of a stolen election helped sow doubts that party members are now using to explain why new voting restrictions are needed. We are not prepared to suggest any criminal behavior. We don't have any evidence beyond reasonable doubt for that. But there is evidence beyond all doubt of mass confusion and inconsistencies between polling places and the handling of provisional ballots, says Al Lindsay, a lawyer and GOP chair in Butler County, north of Pittsburgh. Talk of stolen election and revolution lives in an environment where people lack confidence that it really is one man, one vote. That then becomes a breeding ground for conspiracy theories and fraud, and it's very, very dangerous. Meanwhile, in Georgia, 38% of the electorate believe there was widespread fraud in the election. That's despite two statewide recounts, including one by hand. The breakdown: 76% of Republicans say the election was fraudulent, compared with 40% of independents and 4% of Democrats, according to a poll released last week by the University of Georgia. Post-election efforts to influence Georgia's vote tally are also raising concerns. Today, Fulton County District Attorney Fannie T. Willis announced a criminal investigation into efforts to overturn the election, reportedly including the call to Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, in which Mr. Trump said, "All I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes." After making Joe Biden the first Democrat since Bill Clinton in 1992 to win the state, Georgia voters followed that up on January 5th by booting two incumbent Republican senators in a runoff in favor of two Democratic senators, tipping the balance of power in Washington. That has left the state GOP split between those who claim the election was bogus and those who want to move on and argue the party's merit directly with voters. The GOP is going to have to increase their base by appealing to minority voters and immigration from outside the South into the state, says Trey Hood, a political scientist at the University of Georgia in Athens. But some Republicans see it another way. They've got to change the major parts of election laws so that we at least have a shot of winning, Alice Olenek, an election official in suburban Atlanta, told the Gwinnett Daily Post. Georgia lawmakers have filed 11 bills ranging from a ban on new residents voting in a runoff to ending no-excuse absentee ballots. The bill, however, face steep odds. For one, ease of voting rules are popular among majorities of Democrats and Republicans, and most people want to believe that elections are fair. One bill likely to pass would add an ID requirement to absentee ballots. Polls show that a majority of voters, regardless of race, support that idea. Legacy of Jim Crow. In the South, Jim Crow-era voters' suppression of the black vote was justified in the name of election integrity. In fact, the phrase voter fraud has historically been linked in the South with the black vote. The North saw similar disenfranchisements of immigrants, including the Irish. It appeared again in November, when Republican complaints centered on majority black districts while accepting results from majority white areas. There has long been a sense in the U.S. that we need to make sure that good, simple Jeffersonian farmers were represented and not the urban mob, says Mr. Epps, author of American Epic, Reading the U.S. Constitution. This nostalgia from an earlier republic, this belief that the Constitution embodies certain values that we would call authoritarian, is very deep-rooted in American conservative history, he adds. In both Georgia and Arizona, which also flipped for Mr. Biden and sent two Democratic senators to the Capitol, widespread Democratic shift may be changing the political makeup in the states in ways that will endure past 2020. Those demographic and political shifts underscore, says State Representative Salmon, how efforts to restrict the vote ultimately failed to silence the resolve of the majority. It's actually very exciting that we are succeeding in an election system where there have been barriers put into place. With the end of that article, let's move on. A Giving Spirit: Getting Children in Foster Care Through the Pandemic by Chelsea Shaisley. You don't want me. The words spilled out of 4-year-old Jimmy as he sat crying in an unfamiliar bedroom, his third foster home in 2 weeks. Earlier that week, in another house, he had run from window to window, watching his caseworker depart and shouting, "Don't leave me!" The first 2 families couldn't keep him because the parents worked full-time and no in-person preschool was available due to pandemic-related school closures. Closures the agency hadn't heard about. Since that time, 4 months ago, Jimmy, whose real name isn't being used to protect his privacy, has stayed in the same foster home. His foster parents says he now jokes and plays at bedtime. Caring for him can be difficult, though. He struggles with health problems and trauma, and finding services is tough. But he also gives hugs and shares his drawings freely. He still has the ability to love and bond, and that's what brings me to tears, says his foster mother, who lives in Chicago and asked to remain anonymous to protect Jimmy. Youth in foster care face heightened challenges during the pandemic, which poses severe tests, even while revealing resilience among children and those working with them, and prompting new efforts to help. These glimmers of hope are occurring amid the backdrop of a public health crisis that is disrupting foster care placements, delaying reunification with parents, and adding health and economic stress for biological parents, foster parents, and children who are left without support systems like in-person school or therapy. The whole system has become more sluggish, says Jill Dewar-Barrick, a child welfare researcher and professor at the University of California, Berkeley. It made it more difficult to provide services to families and more difficult to get kids in regular contact with their families. Slowdowns and upticks. A study from Chapin Hall, an independent policy research center at the University of Chicago, estimated child maltreatment reports decreased nationwide 40 to 60% in 2020, compared with the same time period in 2019. Experts don't think that's because abuse fell. Rather, they suspect the shift to remote learning prevented professionals like teachers, who are mandatory reporters of child abuse or neglect, from detecting maltreatment. For children already within foster care, national trends point to delays in court hearings and family reunifications. In California, almost 4,300 fewer children left foster care between October 2019 and September 2020, compared with the same time frame a year earlier, according to the California Child Welfare Indicators Project. Yet individuals within the foster care system point to reasons for hope. Erica Schultz, a foster care licensing specialist at Shelter Inc. in Arlington Heights, Illinois, says the number of licensed foster homes in her agency has grown during the pandemic, from 37 last spring to 44 now. I think people are in a giving spirit. They want to help in any way that they can and see this as an opportunity to help those in need during this really tough time during the pandemic, she says. In addition, the COVID-19 relief bill passed at the end of 2020 included $400 million to support older youth as they transition out of foster care. It also placed a moratorium on foster youth aging out of support services during the pandemic. Justin Hayden, a junior at Purdue University Northwest in Hammond, Indiana, even found a benefit in the pandemic. He says the lockdowns gave him time to reflect and heal from hardships, including entering foster care after he and his mother became homeless. He's encouraged by groups he volunteers with, like Foster Club and Foster Success, which organize virtual forums for foster youth to support each other. They give each other such great advice, he says. Abolish or reform the system? In the wake of George Floyd's death last year and racial justice protests across the country, the foster system has come under increased scrutiny. Before the pandemic, about 424,000 children were in foster care in 2019, according to the U.S. Children's Bureau, with Black and Indigenous children overrepresented. In June, Black Families Matter protesters in New York called to abolish the city's Administration for Children's Services, charging that the department systematically used racist policies that are overly punitive for Black people. But Naomi Schaefer Riley, a resident fellow focused on child welfare and foster care at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, is concerned that protests against foster care will result in less qualified professionals entering the field, fewer people wanting to be foster parents, and less attention paid to drug abuse and mental health problems in biological families. If you feel like you're joining a system that's terrible and systematically racist, I don't think a lot of people will jump at that chance, she says. In the case of Angela Quijada Banks, a 24-year-old living in San Diego, California, the pandemic and social justice protests motivated her to help by writing her first book, The Black Foster Youth Handbook, which she self-published last fall. It offers lessons for foster youth and the adults working with them. For Miss Wijada Banks, entering foster care at 16 meant splitting up from her tight-knit siblings, which left her mourning the loss of her big sister role. She came close to finishing college, but dropped out to help her biological father when his health failed. Miss Wijada Banks hopes to finish college, though she knows the odds are against her. Recent data is sparse, but earlier studies estimate that between 2 and 9% of foster youth who graduate from high school earn a bachelor's degree. Now married and an entrepreneur, Ms. Wijada Banks supports reforms to the foster care system that connect children to their extended families. She said individuals like her grandmother, who showed her unconditional love, as well as her therapist and some school teachers, helped her get through tough years in foster care. They believed in me and spoke life into me when I didn't feel very much alive, she said. Charting new paths through the pandemic. Foster youth and individuals working with them have gotten creative during the pandemic. Marcia Hopkins oversees a foster youth advocacy program at the Juvenile Law Center in Philadelphia. Normally, teenagers in the program gather in person to bond with each other, learn about the foster care system, and work on a group advocacy project. Last year, the program went virtual, but many of the teenagers didn't have reliable internet or devices. Ms. Hopkins and other staff workers worked to get laptops to the foster youth who needed them and received grant funding to pay for virtual therapeutic and wellness coaching. Managing emotional wellness was a big thing that our youth people identified and brought up, she said. Alicia Webby, a foster parent from Crystal Lake, Illinois, organized a donation drive that provided holiday presents to more than 400 foster youths, up from 100 children the year before. The group provided contactless deliveries and used social media to coordinate requests and donations. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and yet I think our support has actually gone up, says Ms. Waby, who, along with her husband, founded the nonprofit Second Bridge in 2019 to link foster families with community support. I'm hopeful the momentum will keep going, and the idea of being a foster child or having foster children in your home will not be hush-hush, but just something we have to do to help our kids. Back in Chicago, Jimmy's foster parent says she was overwhelmed by the support she received from friends and family who dropped off clothes and toys on her porch and sent food when she and her partner were diagnosed with COVID-19. Above all, she's humbled by her foster son's strength. Here I am feeling sorry for myself. We have COVID, we can't see our parents, and here is this little boy who can still love. After all he's been through, she said. He's absolutely, hands down, the most resilient, not just kid, but person I've ever met. And let's move on. As Canary Islands face migration crisis, former migrants step up to help, by Colette Davis. And I'm going to mispronounce it, but I'm going to do the best I can. Ayagaras, Spain. A winding road snakes up the hillside of Ayagaras, a hamlet nestled deep in the valley of Gran Canaria. Goats graze alongside quaint stone houses, a glimmer of the Atlantic set in the distance. The calm tranquility offers a clean slate, the perfect place to start over. As the Diamanic Ayagaras Center for Youth Migrants, 24 young men are trying to focus on today's lesson, math and Spanish. With classes on the local language and how to navigate Spanish bureaucracy, they hope to be able to do what they spent days crossing an ocean to do, work. But that won't come overnight, and no one knows it better than staff member Abubakar Drame. In 2006, at the age of 17, Mr. Drame left his family home in Mali, bordered by a patera fishing boat in search of better opportunities, and spent 4 days at sea before arriving at Arguiguinguen, Gran Canaria. When he reached port, he was placed in a migrant center near Aranaga. After 2 years there, the staff offered him a job. Now at Dominic Ayagaras, Mr. Drame translates between Spanish and African languages, teaches new migrants the local customs, and helps them fill out paperwork. And as the Canary Islands face the largest swell of migration since 2006, around 22,000 people arrived from North and West Africa last year, he has extended his efforts beyond his 9-to-5 job to volunteer with new migrants on nights and weekends. More than practical support, Mr. Drame and other former migrants like him are proving invaluable resources to aid groups, offering a blend of compassion and tough love based on their own life experience. That is helping migrants adjust to their new circumstances while also giving realistic advice about how they can succeed. They're also countering fears some locals may have of new arrivals, thereby bridging local and migrant communities. I tell these young men the truth, that I went down the same path as them, but that things are not going to be easy, says Mr. Drame. Many think they'll come here and get a job right away, buy a house. It's not like that. I've been here for 14 years. I have Spanish nationality and a job, and it's still hard. Stepping up amid a crisis? Mr. Drame's life back in Mali wasn't stricken with war or famine. He had an education, lived in a meager home, and worked as an Arabic teacher for 2 years in Mauritania. But he was getting increasingly frustrated watching all of his earnings go to his father. It's what ultimately pushed him to leave. Gabriel Naija from Gambia had a similar experience. In 2012, at the age of 16, he left for Senegal without telling his parents, working for 8 months as a fisherman before joining the Patera headed to Europe. My mother was very protective of me, but my father always told me I needed to be strong to be a man, said Mr. Naija. So one day when I was home alone, I opened the window, no bag, no money, and left. Since arriving in Tenerife, Mr. Naija has worked both in Spain and abroad. But when he returned after a 2-month stint as a carpenter in Zurich to find his adopted home in the throes of a migration crisis, he decided to volunteer with a local aid group. Mr. Naija now works out of a hotel in Adige, in south of the island, where more than 400 migrants are being housed. Like Mr. Drame, Mr. Naija helped migrants with police intake, medical visits, and Spanish bureaucracy. He also sneaks in used clothing, mobile phone SIM cards, and skin cream for the men whose legs and feet arrive cracked and peeling from days spent soaking in the ocean water that lines their boats. I'm living off of my savings right now, so eventually I'll need to look for a job, he says. But for now, I'm happy doing this. These men are not living like kings. Mr. Naija and Mr. Drame's volunteerism comes when tension across the Canary Islands is at an all-time high. Amid a pandemic that has destroyed tourism and left 30% of the people here unemployed, the regional government has faced criticism about its handling of the migration crisis. Some say the government should have been more prepared after the 2006 surge when over 30,000 migrants arrived on the island. There is an overwhelming lack of room for decent reception, says Alina Lugli, president of aid group Medicos del Mundo Canarias. However, we do not believe this is due to lack of financial resources or personnel. Rather, it is due to lack of political will and coordination between public administrations. Despite efforts to relocate them to government facilities, around 7,000 migrants remain in hotels, much to the chagrin of some locals who complain that the migrants are living a five-star life. In mid December, the Red Cross told migrants across Gran Canaria to stay indoors after a group of residents in Arguinguin, where several thousand migrants were left stranded for weeks in November, were videotaped shouting insults at migrants and allegedly harassing a group of Moroccans. In the Gambia, I never thought about racism. I never thought I'd face it like I have here, says Mr. Nija. If you don't live it yourself, you see it, you hear it with gestures, looks, words, every day. It's extremely painful. These men are not living like kings. They're eating sandwiches and pasta every day. Many have been here for over 2 months and only have one pair of pants. They wash them at night and dry them over their balcony. They wake up and wear them again the next day. Shifting perspectives. Immigration experts say that when former migrants work with aid agencies, they can help new migrants properly prepare for the challenges they may face, like racism, integration, or finding a job. And it's best that they don't sugarcoat those hardships. Obviously, it's hard. We are not a 100% accepting society, says Maria Fonte Garcia, a professor of social education for the El Observatorio de la Inmigración de Tenerife at the Universidad de La Laguna. Hearing from former migrants is a good thing. They don't lie to them, and they help them redefine their dreams and goals so they can be successful. Mr. Dramé and Mr. Nige's brand of volunteerism can also act as a bridge between migrants and local communities to anchor them as fully participating citizens in society and provide a long-term impact on how communities see migrants, new and old. In order to counteract the fear some people have about those from other cultures, it's important for migrants to hold visible positions in society, says Ms. Fonte Garcia. When they do this, they normalize and create a positive image of new migrants. At the hotel in Ajide, Mr. Nija is on the front lines, but even as his savings start running dry, he doesn't plan on looking for a paid job just yet. Sometimes, when I listen to their stories, it makes me want to cry, says Mr. Nija. But hearing their problems, what they've gone through, it makes me forget my own. Points of progress is our next article. In Mozambique, Mozambique's new fishery laws open the door for communities to help protect a broader range of marine species and develop more sustainable policies. The revised law extends protected status to new species including dolphins, whale sharks, and manta rays, and makes it easier for communities living along the 1,700-mile coastline to lead management initiatives. While co-management has long been the goal in Mozambique, fishery enforcement remains highly centralized. The new law clarifies the framework for local fishing councils to become autonomous, legal entities that can better assert their decision-making power. While implementing the law will take a lot of work, there are some signs that Mozambique is committed to improving environmental protection. The country's largest marine conservation area slashed illegal fishing by nearly half in 2020 compared by 2019, mainly by tightening the inspection process and using signaling buoys to delimit the protected area. And in India's Karnataka state has outlawed Bidhi Chakri, a form of bonded labor in which members of the Dalit caste work in upper caste homes for little or no pay. Debt bondage was legally banned in India in the mid-1970s, but under Bidhi Chakri, there is rarely a formal debt to repay. Instead, the system thrives on a sense of social obligation, with the expectation of free labor being passed down through generations. Anti slavery advocates have long worked to have Biddy Chakri recognized as bonded labor. A 2019 report from Jivika, a charity at the front of the fight, found thousands of Dalit families working for free throughout Karnataka. Workers were often given some grain or pulses in return, and many are afraid to lodge complaints. Advocates say enforcement will require extensive surveys to identify victims and campaigns to overcome fear and support Dalit laborers seeking freedom. Well, that concludes the reading of the Christian Science Monitor for Friday, February the 12th. My name is Pam. Please stay safe until we meet here again. Be blessed. Thank you for having me into your home, and make it a great day.